Watch what happens in a tense room. Someone gets reactive. Someone shuts down. Someone becomes sharp, emotional, unpredictable, overwhelmed. And almost without thinking, you move into the familiar role. You steady the atmosphere. You lower your voice. You become reasonable, measured, controlled. You absorb the charge in the room. So things do not get worse. From the outside, this looks like maturity. It looks like emotional strength. It looks like wisdom, composure, self-mastery. And sometimes it is. But sometimes something much more painful is happening. Sometimes you are not calm because you feel safe. You are calm because you do not feel permitted to be anything else. That is the hidden beginning of this pattern. Carl Jung understood that what the world praises in us can easily become the very mask that imprisons us. A strength can harden into a role. A role can become a persona. And a persona, when overused, starts demanding more from the psyche than it was ever meant to carry. That is exactly what happens when you become the calm one. At first, the role feels useful. Maybe it even saves you. Perhaps you grew up around volatility, and being composed was how you stayed safe. Perhaps other people were emotional enough for everyone, so you became the stable one. Perhaps you learned early that if you reacted honestly, things got worse, but if you stayed measured, thoughtful, and contained, you could preserve some order. So you adapted. That adaptation may have been intelligent, necessary, even, but what protects you in one season of life can quietly begin defining you in the next. And that is where the trouble starts, because now people expect it. They expect you to be the one who understands, the one who does not overreact, the one who can handle it, the one who does not make things harder, the one who remains emotionally organized even when everyone else is unraveling. Over time, you may begin expecting the same thing from yourself. You stop asking, "What do I actually feel?" and start asking, "What version of my feeling is least disruptive?" That difference changes everything. Now your internal world is no longer the center of your response. The atmosphere around you is. You begin managing yourself in relation to the comfort of others. You become highly skilled at regulating your tone, your face, your timing, your words. You know how to swallow irritation before it reaches your mouth. You know how to stay measured when something actually hurts. You know how to keep the room from becoming chaotic. You know how to be the adult in the room, even when no one asks you to carry that role. And because this ability is often admired, it becomes difficult to question. People trust you more because of it, rely on you because of it, come to you because of it. They may even call you strong, grounded, wise, emotionally mature. And again, perhaps some of that is true. But admiration can hide exhaustion very effectively. What people call strength may be draining your inner life in ways they never see. A real-life example makes this clearer. Imagine a family dinner where someone says something cutting. One person gets defensive. Another becomes passive-aggressive. The tension rises. And before anyone notices, you have already stepped into your usual function. You smooth it out, redirect the conversation, make it less explosive. Maybe you even help everyone leave the table feeling relatively okay. Later that night, though, you feel strangely irritated, drained, a little empty. You replay the moment and realize something uncomfortable. You managed everyone else's emotions, but your own reaction never got to exist fully. That is the hidden cost. You were calm on the surface, but inwardly something you had to disappear for that calm to hold. This happens in smaller ways, too. A friend vents to you for an hour and you stay patient, insightful, generous. Afterward, you feel heavy and vaguely resentful, but you quickly shame yourself for that reaction because they needed you. A partner speaks to you in a way that is slightly dismissive, and instead of saying, "That hurt," you become thoughtful and understanding because you know they are stressed. At work, you become the emotionally reliable one, the person who can handle pressure without showing it, and slowly your nervous system starts treating suppression as professionalism. These moments add up. One silence here, one swallowed reaction there, one more instance of being the stable one when what you actually needed was room to be affected. Carl Jung warned that whatever is not lived consciously becomes fate. That applies here with frightening accuracy. If your anger, hurt, overwhelm, need, and emotional truth are consistently denied in the name of being calm, those denied parts do not vanish. They go underground. They gather weight. They become shadow. And the shadow is never passive. It waits. It accumulates. It leaks. That is why so many chronically composed people eventually feel resentment they cannot explain. Not because they are bad, ungrateful, or secretly cruel. Because too much of their actual humanity has been forced below the surface in order to maintain a role. This is where the role becomes a prison. Being the calm one stops being a gift you can offer and becomes a condition you're required to live inside. You may start noticing that you do not know how to have conflict cleanly anymore, not because you are incapable of truth, but because truth has become fused with danger. If your psyche learned that emotional disruption leads to loss of love, chaos, or punishment, then calmness stops being one emotional register among many. It becomes your permitted identity. That is why even healthy anger can feel wrong. Even honest disappointment can feel excessive. Even saying, "I'm hurt," can feel heavier than it should. The persona of calmness becomes morally loaded. You begin to feel good when you remain composed and ashamed when you feel too much. This is where the split deepens. Outwardly, you remain admirable. Inwardly, you become harder and harder to reach. Not because you lack depth, because your depth has been forced into containment for too long. Many people living this pattern do not explode often. That is another reason it remains hidden. They are not obviously dysregulated. They are not constantly fighting with people. They are not visibly chaotic. In fact, they may look like the most emotionally developed person in the room. But inside, something is narrowing. You stop bringing your full emotional truth into relationships. You start pre-editing it, refining it, reducing it, turning it into something acceptable before it ever reaches another person. You begin relating through a filtered self, the calm self, the composed self, the self that can be present for everyone else, but is becoming increasingly unavailable to its own more difficult emotional realities. This is where a subtle loneliness appears. And it is a very particular kind of loneliness. You may be deeply valued by others, even loved. People may rely on you, admire you, trust you with their inner worlds. And still, a part of you remains untouched, because the self they are meeting is often the one most carefully regulated for safety. They know your steadiness, your insight, your patience. But do they know your anger, your frustration, your helplessness, your exhaustion? The part of you that sometimes does not want to be wise, composed, generous, or understanding. Often the answer is no. And that no is where the ache begins. You may realize that you are surrounded by people who feel safe with you, but very few people with whom you feel safe being emotionally uncomposed. That asymmetry matters. It means the role is no longer simply relational. It is structural. Your whole system may have learned that love is safest when you are controlled. That makes emotional authenticity difficult, not impossible, but costly. And over time, that cost shows up in symptoms. Fatigue that rest does not fully solve. Irritation that appears in small, disproportionate ways. A numbness around your own needs. A secret desire to disappear from everyone for a while, because being available has become too psychologically expensive. Sometimes even a fantasy of breaking down can appear, not because you truly want to collapse, but because some part of you is tired of being the one who never gets to. That fantasy is revealing. It tells you the psyche is overburdened. Jung wrote, "No one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort." The moral effort here is not about becoming nicer. It is about facing the truth that your calmness may not be pure peace. It may be adaptation mixed with fear. It may be wisdom mixed with self-suppression. It may be love mixed with self-abandonment. That is hard to admit, especially if your whole identity has been built around being the one who handles things well. But unless it is admitted, nothing changes. You will continue mistaking composure for wholeness. You will continue believing that, because you are not explosive, you must be okay. You will continue offering the room your stability, while the deeper parts of you keep waiting for someone, anyone, to notice how much that stability is costing. So the real question is no longer, why am I always the calm one? The deeper question is, what have I not been allowed to feel show, or say in order to remain that person. That is the threshold. Because once you ask that honestly, the role starts becoming visible for what it really is. Not only a strength, but also a strategy. And strategies can outlive their usefulness. When that happens, the very quality that once made you feel safe begins making you feel trapped. That is where this journey truly starts. Not with anger management, not with boundaries in the shallow sense, with the painful, liberating realization that staying calm may have become one of the most socially acceptable ways you disappear from yourself. Listen to the sentence people use to describe you. You're always so calm. If that sentence lands like praise and pressure at the same time, this section is for you. Because Carl Jung would immediately ask a question most people never ask. Is your calmness an expression of wholeness, or is it a persona built to prevent danger? That question matters. A lot. Jung used the word persona to describe the social mask, the face we wear in order to function, belong, and remain acceptable in the world. He never said the persona was fake in a childish sense. In fact, Jung knew it was necessary. You need a persona to work, relate, organize yourself, and move through society without chaos. But Jung also warned that the persona becomes dangerous when the ego identifies with it too strongly. And that is exactly what often happens with the calm one. You are not just someone who can be calm. You become the person who must be calm. That shift changes everything. Because now composure is no longer a flexible response. It is an identity requirement. Now the psyche is not asking, what do I truly feel here? It is asking, how do I remain the one who never becomes difficult? Carl Jung would see this as a classic one-sided adaptation. One side of the personality becomes conscious, polished, rewarded, admired. The opposite side gets pushed down. So if your conscious identity becomes patience, steadiness, thoughtfulness, and emotional control, what falls into shadow? Anger, impatience, raw hurt, need, confusion, the wish to be comforted instead of always being the one who comforts, the wish to be allowed to react instead of always being the one who understands. That hidden side does not disappear. Jung was crystal clear about this. One of his most quoted and most relevant ideas here is, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This applies directly to emotional suppression. If your irritation stays unconscious, it still directs you. If your hurt stays unconscious, it still shapes your relationships. If your resentment stays unconscious, it still leaks out through tone, exhaustion, numbness, distance, or sudden disproportionate reactions that seem to come out of nowhere. They do not come out of nowhere. Carl Jung would say they come from the shadow. That is why some of the calmest people eventually become the most inwardly divided. Outwardly, they remain measured, intelligent, compassionate. Inwardly, they feel heavy, irritable, quietly unseen, and increasingly distant from their own emotional truth. A real-life example makes this obvious. Imagine someone at work who is known for never losing composure. Everyone brings them problems because they are the stable one. They mediate conflict, absorb pressure, stay professional, never make scenes. For years, this gets rewarded. Promotions, trust, respect. But privately, the person begins feeling drained in ways they cannot explain. Sunday evenings feel heavier. Small requests trigger outsized irritation. One harmless email makes them want to throw the laptop across the room. What happened? Did they suddenly become immature? Not at all. From a Jungian point of view, the shadow has become overloaded. Too much frustration has been pushed underground in order to maintain the persona of emotional control. Carl Jung repeatedly showed that the psyche compensates for one-sided consciousness. If you live too far into one approved identity, the neglected opposite gathers force in the unconscious. That is not failure. That is psychic law. So if you are praised for being endlessly composed, your buried emotional truth will eventually demand expression in some form. Maybe through resentment. Maybe through emotional flatness. Maybe through passive aggression. Maybe through the fantasy of disappearing from everyone. Maybe through a collapse that confuses the people around you, because you are always the strong one. Jung would not be surprised by that collapse. He would see it as delayed psychic correction. Here is another Jung quote that belongs right in the center of this conversation. No one can become conscious of the shadow, without considerable moral effort. Why moral effort? Because it takes courage to admit that your beautiful strengths may also conceal fear. It takes honesty to say, my calmness is not always peace. My maturity is not always freedom. My understanding is not always generosity. Sometimes my composure is self-protection. Sometimes I stay calm because anger feels dangerous. Sometimes I stay calm because need feels shameful. Sometimes I stay calm because I do not believe I am allowed to let my reactions exist in public. That is difficult truth, and Jung would insist on it, because without that truth, the persona remains idealized. You keep thinking the role is purely good, while the parts sacrificed to maintain the role go on suffering in silence. This becomes especially important in family systems and intimate relationships. Carl Jung knew that we are shaped by emotional environments long before we consciously understand them. If you grew up around volatility, criticism, unpredictability, or emotional fragility, staying calm may have become your way of preserving connection. You learned that reacting honestly made things worse. So you became the regulated one, reasonable, measured, the safe child, the easy one, the mature one. That adaptation may have been brilliant, but brilliance in childhood can become imprisonment in adulthood, because the conditions may have changed while the psyche kept obeying the old rule. So now, even in safer environments, your system still says, stay composed. Do not escalate. Do not become too much. Do not burden the room with your full truth. That is not maturity. That is history still living in the nervous system. Carl Jung would call this a complex, an emotionally charged structure from the past that keeps activating in the present. A conflict complex, a shame complex, a rejection complex. Whatever the exact form, the result is the same. The present moment gets filtered through old emotional logic. So your partner's dismissive tone is not only today's event, it touches old material. Your friend's neediness is not only today's inconvenience, it activates the ancient rule that your needs must wait. Your boss's pressure is not only today's stress, it awakens a whole structure surviving through composure. And because that whole structure is bigger than the present event, your emotional response becomes split. Outwardly calm, inwardly burdened. That split is a problem. Carl Jung would also look closely at inflation by goodness, though he might not use that exact modern phrase. Sometimes the calm one, identity becomes morally superior in subtle ways, not arrogant outwardly, but inwardly fixed. You begin unconsciously defining yourself as the reasonable one among unreasonable people, the emotionally mature one among emotional people, the stable one among unstable people. That identity can feel noble. But Jung would warn that any identity built on one-sided virtue carries shadow. Because the more attached you become to being the composed one, the more fiercely the unconscious will carry what does not fit that image. Then anger becomes even more shameful. Need becomes even more humiliating. Breakdown becomes even more terrifying. Why? Because now these states do not merely feel uncomfortable. They threaten the very image through which you know yourself. And that is why so many calm people secretly fear their own emotional truth, not because the truth is monstrous, but because it does not fit the role. Jung would call for integration, not role destruction. This is important. The answer is not to become reactive just to prove you have feelings. The answer is not to perform anger. The answer is not to throw away emotional regulation. Jung always aimed for wholeness, not reversal. So the real task is this. Can calmness remain a capacity without becoming a prison? Can you be composed when composition is true, and affected when affectedness is true? Can you be loving without self-erasure? Can you be patient without suppressing your anger? Can you remain thoughtful without forcing your nervous system to deny what is actually happening inside you? That is Jung's deeper question, and it is a profound one. Because once calmness becomes flexible again, the whole psyche breathes differently. Now the calm one is no longer the only acceptable self. Now anger can become information instead of shame. Hurt can become language instead of hidden weight. Need can become relational truth instead of private embarrassment. Carl Jung would likely say that this is the beginning of a more conscious relation between ego and shadow. The ego no longer has to preserve its goodness by banishing everything difficult underground. Instead, the person begins holding opposites: steadiness and frustration, love and anger, compassion and boundary, maturity and emotional honesty. This ability to hold opposites is one of Jung's deepest markers of psychological development. A less developed personality must stay one thing. A more developed one can remain internally complex without splitting itself in half. That is why this matters so much. If you never question the role of the calm one, you may spend years being admired while slowly disappearing from your own life. People may continue trusting you, needing you, and praising your strength, while the hidden parts of you grow more bitter, more tired, more unreachable. But if you begin doing the moral effort Jung asked for, if you begin admitting the shadow beneath the calm persona, something changes. Your composure stops being a cage. It becomes a choice. And that is the difference between adaptation and freedom. So the real Jungian question under this whole pattern is not, why am I so good at staying calm? It is, what parts of me had to become invisible for this calmness to be possible? That is the doorway. Because once you answer that honestly, you stop worshiping the mask, and you finally begin meeting the human being underneath it. Picture a familiar scene. Someone disappoints you. They speak carelessly. They take more than they notice. They lean on your steadiness again, as if your patience were an endless resource. And right there, in that ordinary moment, the old pattern begins forming almost automatically. You breathe, you regulate, you make sense of their behavior, you stay composed, you choose a mature response. But this time, something is different. This time, instead of asking only how to keep the situation manageable, you ask a more honest question. What is this costing me? That is where the real shift begins. Carl Jung would call this a movement toward consciousness, not toward impulsiveness, not toward emotional chaos. Consciousness. The old role of the calm one survives because it feels morally safe and socially rewarded. But the moment you begin seeing its psychic cost clearly, the role starts losing its innocence. Now you can no longer pretend your composure is always pure peace. Now you know that some of it has been self-protection. Some of it has been fear. Some of it has been the unconscious belief that your love becomes more acceptable when it is not emotionally demanding. And once it becomes visible, a new possibility appears. You can stay kind without abandoning your own experience. That sounds simple until real life tests it. A friend unloads on you again and again, but never really asks how you are. A partner says something sharp, then expects your usual understanding. A family member presses on the same emotional bruise and assumes you will absorb it because you always have. In the past, your first move may have been immediate regulation of the field. Smooth it out. Explain it away. Stay bigger than the moment. Stay above the reaction. But Jung would push you towards something deeper than staying above it. He would ask whether your calmness is still connected to the truth of the psyche or whether it has become a defense against the truth of the psyche. That is everything. Because real maturity is not emotional numbness with good manners. Real maturity is the ability to remain conscious while being affected. That means you are allowed to feel the sting, allowed to notice the anger, allowed to register the exhaustion before it turns into private bitterness, allowed to say internally first and then outwardly when needed, this is not actually okay for me. This is the part many people misunderstand. They think the alternative to chronic composure is collapse. If I stop being the calm one, I'll become reactive. If I let myself feel anger, I'll become unfair. If I stop absorbing everything, I'll become selfish or cruel. Carl Jung would reject that split. He did not believe the psyche had only two options, repression or chaos. His whole psychology points toward integration. And integration means opposites can coexist. You can be generous and angry, patient and firm, compassionate and unwilling, emotionally aware and still deeply affected. This is one of Jung's greatest contributions. He gives you permission to stop choosing between false goodness and unconscious rage. He gives you a third way, conscious feeling. A real-life example makes this clearer. Imagine you are in a conversation with someone you care about. They interrupt you repeatedly. They explain your own emotions back to you in a patronizing way. The old version of you might smile tightly, keep the peace, finish the conversation, and later feel a wave of resentment that seems to come from nowhere. The more conscious version does something different. Not dramatic, not theatrical. You notice the irritation while it is still small. You stay in contact with your body. You do not immediately shame the reaction. And then maybe you say something simple, "Let me finish," or "That didn't land well," or "I get what you're trying to say, but I need you to stop interpreting me right now." Those sentences are not aggressive. They are not collapse. They are forms of self-presence. For someone trapped in the calm persona, this can feel enormous because it means you are no longer using wisdom as a disguise for self-erasure. Jung would likely say this is the ego becoming less identified with the persona and more related to the total personality. The persona of calmness does not disappear. It simply stops ruling everything. Now anger can enter consciousness without becoming possession. Hurt can enter consciousness without becoming weakness. Need can enter consciousness without becoming humiliation. That is real psychological development. And it changes the body too. When you repeatedly override your reactions, the body learns that honesty is unsafe. It sends a signal, but the conscious self refuses to act. Over time, signals become louder. Irritation becomes resentment. Fatigue becomes shutdown. Hurt becomes numbness. Or the whole thing explodes later in a form that does not match the moment. This is why people who are always calm often confuse everyone when they finally snap. Others think the reaction came from nowhere. It did not. It came from 100 unspoken moments, 100 silent accommodations, 100 small betrayals of feeling in the name of maintaining the role. Jung's quote belongs here with force. No one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. The moral effort, in your case, is not about becoming nicer. It is about telling the truth sooner, before your shadow has to do it for you, before your resentment becomes the only voice strong enough to speak, before your nervous system has to create symptoms because your words never arrived in time. This is what Section 3 is really about. Learning that being affected does not mean being out of control. Learning that you can let a reaction exist without becoming ruled by it. Learning that the first duty is not always to protect the room. Sometimes the first duty is to remain loyal to what is actually happening inside you. That loyalty will feel strange at first, possibly guilty, possibly sharp, possibly less spiritual than the old persona liked to imagine itself being. But Carl Jung will remind you that wholeness is not built through moral image. It is built through truth. And truth is often less polished than persona. You may begin noticing that the hardest part is not speaking. It is permitting yourself to feel before you edit the feeling into something others can tolerate. That is a profound discipline. To pause and ask, what do I actually feel here, before I make it digestible? That question can change an entire life. Because the calm persona often edits too early, too quickly, too automatically. The feeling appears, and almost instantly it is translated into a more acceptable form. Anger becomes understanding. Hurt becomes perspective. Disappointment becomes compassion for the other person. Exhaustion becomes, "I'm fine." But once you stop editing so quickly, a truer emotional life begins. You may discover that you are more affected than you allowed yourself to know. More disappointed, more tired, more alone, more in need of reciprocal care. That can be painful, but it is a clean pain, a pain of contact. Much better than the dirty pain of chronic self-abandonment. There is grief here too. Carl Jung understood that every real transformation includes mourning. If you stop being the calm one in the old way, you may grieve the identity built around that role. You may grieve the admiration it brought, the moral certainty it gave you, the way it let you feel superior to Messier people, the way it protected you from needing too much. This grief should not be skipped, because if you do not grieve the old role, you may keep secretly returning to it whenever life feels uncertain. The old role was costly, yes, but it was also familiar. And familiar prisons often feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. That is why integration takes repetition. One true sentence, one honest pause, one moment where you stay connected to your reaction instead of converting it into acceptability. Then another, and another. This is how the psyche learns that honesty does not automatically destroy love. That conflict does not automatically equal abandonment. that you can be less composed and more real without becoming dangerous. Carl Jung would call this holding the tension of opposites. You are no longer only calm or only angry, only strong or only needy, only wise or only wounded. You become large enough to contain complexity without banishing half of yourself to preserve the image of the other half. That is the real freedom waiting beyond the role, and it changes your relationships in important ways. Some people may not like the change. That matters, because it reveals who is attached to your calmness more than your personhood, who loved the role, who depended on your endless emotional management, who confuse your self-suppression with stability. That can be painful to see, but it is clarifying. Other relationships may deepen, because now something more mutual becomes possible. Now you are no longer only the one who absorbs. You can also be the one who is affected, the one who needs room, the one who says, "That hurt," and stays in the room without apologizing for having been touched. That is intimacy, not the old version built on your constant regulation of everyone else's experience. A truer one, a more human one. So the question is no longer, how do I stay calm no matter what? The better question is, how do I remain conscious enough to let myself be real? That is the deeper Jungian movement here, not toward losing control, toward losing the need to disappear in order to remain acceptable. And once that begins, your calmness changes quality. It stops being a mask. It becomes a choice, a real strength, not the strength of suppression, the strength of a self that no longer has to amputate its own emotional truth in order to be loved. That is what it means to let yourself be affected without falling apart. And that may be one of the most honest forms of power a person can have. Here is the difficult truth beneath this whole pattern. What people admire in you may be the exact thing that is exhausting you. Your calmness, your composure, your ability to stay measured when other people become chaotic, your ability to understand, absorb, regulate, soften, stabilize. All of that may be real. All of that may even be beautiful. But Carl Jung would ask the question most people around you never ask. What has this strength been costing the rest of your psyche? That is the real issue, because a quality can be genuine and still become one-sided. A strength can become overdeveloped. A virtue can become a mask. And when that happens, the psyche starts paying in silence. You may still look strong on the outside, still be the trusted one, still be the one others come to when they are overwhelmed, reactive, confused, or falling apart. But inwardly, something else may be happening. You may be growing tired of being the emotional container, tired of being the one who has to remain thoughtful when others get to be messy, tired of always translating your own reactions into something mature, measured, and easy for everyone else to receive, tired of being valued most in the places where you're at least allowed to be fully human. That tiredness matters. Jung would never tell you to ignore it. He would see it as compensation, as the psyche trying to rebalance a life that has become too identified with one narrow form of selfhood. If the conscious personality says, "I am the composed one, the reasonable one, the one who handles everything well," then the unconscious begins collecting everything that image excludes. Hurt, anger, need, exhaustion, the wish to be held instead of always holding. And if those parts remain underground too long, they do not disappear. They become heaviness, resentment, numbness, sudden inner distance, or the private fantasy of disappearing from everyone because the role has become too expensive to maintain. This is why the real problem was never your ability to stay calm. The real problem was the idea that calmness had to be your only acceptable emotional form. That is what has to change. Not because emotional control is bad. Not because Jung would have wanted you to become reckless or reactive. Quite the opposite. Jung's whole psychology points toward wholeness, and wholeness means you are no longer forced to choose between false composure and unconscious eruption. It means you can be calm when calm is true, angry when anger is true, hurt when hurt is true, and loving without making love dependent on your silence. That is a much deeper kind of maturity. Before we close, pause with one honest question. What feeling in you has had the least permission to exist because of the role of the calm one? Anger? Disappointment? Need? Helplessness? The wish to say, "I do not want to be the one holding this right now"? Stay with that. Because the answer reveals the exact part of yourself that has been living in shadow while your persona received all the praise. And that shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you asking to come back into life. If this resonates, write in the comments one situation where you realize your calmness was not peace. It was self-suppression, not the polished answer. The real moment, the one where you knew you were managing the room while quietly leaving yourself behind. And if you know someone who is always composed, always reasonable, always a strong one, but who seems secretly exhausted in a way no one really sees, you may share this video with them. Sometimes the deepest wound is not being too emotional. Sometimes it is never feeling allowed to be emotional enough to remain whole. And Jung would remind you of something essential here. You were never meant to become a mask so perfect that your real feelings had nowhere left to live. You were meant to become whole. And that wholeness begins the moment your calmness stops being a prison and starts becoming a choice. See you in the next video.